Hey gang, this week's episode is brought to you by Royal Retros, the king of throwbacks. Hey, if you're looking for teams and leagues that don't exist anymore, but you'd like to remember them in high quality jersey or uniform format, hey, some of those teams were legendary, some of them were disasters, but they all live at Royal Retros. Check them out. RoyalRetros.com. Use that promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. Check them out now. And now, check out this episode.
Oh, somewhere in this favored land, the sun is shining bright. The band is playing somewhere, and somewhere hearts are light. And somewhere men are laughing, and somewhere children shout. But there is no joy in Gotham. The National League's moved out. But in San Francisco, the band is playing and the flags are flying. The big city is big league for the first time, and a gala parade down Market Street bids the San Francisco Giants welcome as they open the season in their new home. An extra burst of cheers greets Willie Mays riding here with Hank Sauer. The Say Hey Kid is at home already. A parade that marks the making of baseball history. San Francisco Giants meet Los Angeles Dodgers, the West Coast's first big league baseball game ever, but incidentally a continuation of an old diamond rivalry. Old familiar faces, managers Walt Alston and Bill Rigney. And Mrs. John J. McGraw, widow of the greatest Giant of them all, who lends her prestige to the new environment. The ball game, historic and terrific. Harold Spencer homers with the Giants already ahead by 2 runs. San Francisco has something to cheer about. Final score, Giants 8, Dodgers 0.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, let's get this show on the road, shall we? How are you, everybody? My name is Tim Hanlon, and hopefully you know by now this is Good Seats Still Available. Yeah, it's the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. We do this for you each and every week, or at least we try to, and we appreciate you finding us this week and downloading us, putting us in your earbuds, pods, whatever, however you're ingesting the show. We appreciate it, and welcome back. This week, interesting conversation about a equally interesting story. From our guest this week, Steve Wiegand, longtime author, many years, 30 plus years in newspaper journalism. This is his first sports book, and it comes literally and figuratively out of left field. It is the story. It's called The Uncommon Life of Danny O'Connell. Now, who's Danny O'Connell? Danny O'Connell is a baseball player who played in the major leagues in the 1950s, mostly in the 1950s. The minors in the late 1940s, and was a coach in the majors in the early 1960s. A admittedly average player, pretty decent stats, not a Hall of Famer by any stretch, but a popular player, played lots of infield positions, second base, shortstop, third base. Born and raised in Paterson, New Jersey, got his first taste of minor league baseball playing for the local team in Bloomfield, New Jersey, Bloomingdale. There's a Bloomfield, New Jersey, too, by the way. But the Bloomingdale Troopers in Bloomingdale, New Jersey, in the Class D, 1946, this is post-war. And it's an interesting story. Okay, you would say, why? Well, what's so special about this guy? And the picture of him on the cover of this Steve Wiegand authored book is an artistic rendering of his San Francisco Giants days and a recreation of one of his baseball cards. The story is intriguing because it's essentially a bit of a metaphor for perhaps what is sort of referred to on a lot of different fronts, historically for sure, a golden era perhaps of America's pastime. We're talking about the post-war era, and that's the time that this guy, Danny O'Connell, was in the minors, grinding his way through places like Bloomingdale, New Jersey, and then up in Canada with Trois-Rivieres in the Canadian American League, and then Greenville, South Carolina, playing for the Spinners in the Class A, and then going to play in St. Paul and Indianapolis in the AAA realms in the American Association, and then making his debut about 5 years after starting his professional career in earnest with Pittsburgh. A pretty a common pathway for players of that era and that time. Revered players were for making that sacrifice and becoming and living that dream. But then, this story kind of takes some other turns, and it's not just specifically that of this guy, Danny O'Connell, but representative of what else was going on with baseball players during his lifetime during this age. As the 50s dawned, he played for Pittsburgh, the Pirates, in his first year. And then for 2 years, he was drafted to serve in the U.S. military in Korea during the Korean War. Not too uncommon issue or thing with various players, not just in baseball, various sports, but O'Connell went and served his country with pride and came back and played with the Pittsburgh Pirates in the 1953 season again. Pretty interesting stuff. And again, it's a testament to the early 1950s when lunch pail guys were being drafted, and it was still very much an American war effort, in this case, Korea, and trying to sort of serve one's country while also, in essence, trying to balance a professional baseball career. And again, no guarantees that you're going to come back, and let alone be eager to play, and let alone able to play, if not that, for perhaps even not even coming back at all. But that's also part of the story that Danny O'Connell, represents. Went on to play, like I said before, with the Milwaukee Braves and the New York Giants, and was part of interesting dynamics in Major League Baseball during the 50s, which included relocation of pretty huge significance and expansion and all that kind of stuff, right? So when he joined the Milwaukee Braves, it was only in their second year after having moved from Boston. So pretty interesting time to be a Major League Baseball player for a team that had spent decades in another city and was becoming quite the thing in a brand new city that was aiming to become Major League, in this case, Milwaukee. We've had a number of conversations about the Milwaukee version of the Braves. In 57, he found himself with the then New York Giants. Now, debatable whether he actually knew that Horace Stoneham was going to be moving that franchise, but sure enough, they did. So he played for the Giants, which was kind of a thrill for this guy O'Connell, because he's born and raised in New Jersey and grew up in the shadows of both the Dodgers and the Giants, and of course the Yankees too. So all three of those teams, and getting to play it basically for his home team, or one of his home teams. And then they along with the Dodgers are moving out west. And then soon enough, next season, he's with San Francisco. And that's where that clip, by the way, comes into play. It's a newsreel clip. I think we've played it before on some other occasions. But lo and behold, opening day for San Francisco and the Los Angeles version of the Dodgers on April 15th, 1958, the very first game for both of these teams in their newly incarnated forms. Who's on the starting lineup and batting seventh in the lineup, playing second base? Yes, Danny O'Connell is there. 2 at-bats. He had I think he walked once, and he was responsible for one of the runs. It was an 8-0 win by those San Francisco Giants, hosting the LA Dodgers at Seals Stadium, their temporary facility, until Candlestick was built. So the land was purchased, right? And then it was built. But the story of Danny O'Connell is it's extraordinarily ordinary. And you will see as we get in our conversation further with Steve Wiegand in a few moments, after his San Francisco National League adventure, it becomes a bit more of a relatively ragtag kind of denouement, if you will. The Washington Senators, he goes into, which is also an interesting story, because 1961, when he was with the Senators, a little bit of play, a little bit of coaching at the same time, maybe some ideation of becoming a coach full-time, a manager perhaps. The Washington Senators, as you may remember, 1961, that was actually the second version of the Senators, because the year before that, or the team that was there the year before that, they had absconded to Minnesota to become the Twins. So this is an interesting guy who was around a lot of very interesting pivots in baseball's history at the time. But as you'll hear in our conversation, is also very, very emblematic of sort of the traditional, like, regular guy, and not just a regular guy in terms of his family. As we'll hear, he died early in life. He died when he was 40 years old. You'll hear that he did essentially the right things. He went back into baseball after kind of having fallen in the minors for a little bit of time, because he wanted to earn another year and a half against a pension so that he could be supportive of his family back at home, who had sacrificed a lot to sort of travel with him and evolve with him as a baseball player, right? That was a pretty somewhat common thing, especially in the 1950s. but it's also a sense and maybe a celebration, if you will, of just the average player, who kind of made up not only Major League Baseball back in the day, but also today, right? These are players that might be in the minors for a couple of years. They might go up, they might go down, they might go sideways. They may never break through, but they're role players. They're there. They're constantly. They may have some great games. They may wind up being the hero of a game or two. And I'm not giving the story quite great justice, but the book certainly does. And again, Steve Wiegand is the guest, and the book is called "The Uncommon Life of Danny O'Connell." The subtitle is "A Tale of Baseball Cards, quote, average players, and the true value of America's game." So we get into a whole bunch of different dynamics of this. There's a little bit about sports memorabilia in here, sort of like living in the 50s and what it was to be an American worker at the time. A little bit of a dip into the golden era of the pastime, the America's pastime of baseball, being a cultural cornerstone and that kind of stuff. What one does one's playing career is over, and how to sort of grapple with that and become a new formed human and or professional in some way, shape, or form. We get into all those dynamics, and it's a really interesting tableau, all welded and melded, both of those together into a very interesting story. And look, the preface, the cover jacket is there's a quote by Bob Costas, right? So how many times have I read a book or seen a book that Bob Costas has done a blurb for? But he's also joined by people like Tom Verducci and others for this book. So don't take my word for it, just for theirs as well. And it's a really interesting story. The gentleman that we feature in this conversation may seem statistically ordinary, but I can assure you by the end of this conversation, and perhaps after reading this book, you will think otherwise. And that's the purpose of our chat this week with Steve Wiegand, our guest. And let's see, if you want to get a copy of this book, both either during or after this broadcast, by all means, please go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode 355. And again, we post all of our episodes there. And you'll find a couple of convenient links to this book. It's in hardcover or Kindle version. Amazon will ship it to you as quickly as humanly possible. And you will get a copy of this book and enjoy it as much as I did. It is published by Bancroft Press. And as they say, you'll be glad you did. And hopefully you'll be glad you did. Stay around for this chat. Let's talk about this story. Let's talk about Danny O'Connell. And let's talk about his uncommon yet uncommon life and what it means and the stories behind it, including how it came to be. Let's get into asking why Steve sort of focused on this one guy to sort of tell his narrative. It's a really interesting story. I hope you enjoy it. Please, as always, enjoy. I will say this the premise of this book is absolutely fantastic because the idea behind this story, I think, really speaks to the heart and soul of baseball. And why don't you give our audience a bit of background on you and your adjunct to baseball, and in particular, how you came across this guy as the metaphor for this story.
Well, in terms of my career, I am quintessentially lazy. So I became a newspaper reporter so I could watch other people work and write about it. And so I had a 35-year career in newspapers in California, mostly as a political writer, but I covered in that span a lot of different subjects from baseball to mass murders. Post journalism career, when I retired early, I became a writer, and I've written this is my 10th nonfiction book, almost all of which have been some aspect of American history. As for my baseball career, such as it was, I was a baseball card collector back when dinosaurs still roamed the earth and I was a kid. And I played through high school, but I was never very good. And the way I came across Danny O'Connell goes back to the pandemic. And during the pandemic, I read a story in the New York Times, I believe, about how baseball card collecting had become a huge investment vehicle for all kinds of people. It became part of portfolios on Wall Street. People were buying shares of rare cards so you could own 10% of a 1952 Mickey Mantle. And it got me to, I remembered a card I'd had as a youth. It was a Danny O'Connell card. And I was a San Francisco Giants fan. And I would go take my allowance every week and go up to the local liquor store and buy my packs of 5-cent baseball cards and either chew or throw away the gum, depending on what kind of shape my jaw was in that day. And I would live to get a card of one of my favorite Giants. And it seemed that the people at the Topps baseball card company had it in for me. And the only card that I could ever get was Danny O'Connell. Now, I didn't know who the heck Danny O'Connell was, but I grew to hate him as a 10 and 11-year-old because it was the only card I could get. But when I read this story about how baseball card collection had become this Wall Street vehicle, I got curious about O'Connell's card. And so I looked him up, and lo and behold, on eBay, there was a Danny O'Connell mint condition 1958 card selling for $13,868. And I thought to myself, who is this guy and why would anybody pay that kind of money? So I started doing a little digging, and the more I got into his story, and the more I realized that his life in general and his career as a baseball player was really a celebration of the ordinary. He was the average guy. He was one of the 24 players on a 25-man team that was the lunch pail carrying guy who went to work every day, and the other guy was Willie Mays. So I got into his story, and the more and more I peeled back layers of what he had gone through and how he exemplified life in America in the 1950s and baseball in particular, the story just kind of grabbed me.
But it's interesting. I think a lot of kids who collected playing cards, baseball and other sports for that matter, cards, probably could probably agree with you on their own personal hellscapes, I guess, in terms of how many a card, a person of not sort of not star quality that would haunt them, and they would have 5 or 6 copies of the same card of said player.
Right.
I don't think that's an uncommon thing. I'm thinking back to my childhood. I don't remember from baseball per se, but I think as I started to collect hockey cards and basketball cards, there were just a litany of players that just were absolutely were nothing special, if anything close to that. But it clearly I would get more of those than anything from a star perspective.
Exactly, and you used the word. You said it was not uncommon, and in fact. In earlier editions of baseball card lists for collectors, cards like Danny O'Connell's were listed not by name, but just as a common. So a Roger Maris card from 1962 might be worth $100, but everybody else would be listed as commons. And what I found that was common does not mean the same as average. And Tim, baseball is, and in most sports, but baseball in particular is a game of statistics. Even the most casual fan is wrapped up in statistics. And I'd like to give you a couple of statistics that show that, as Mark Twain said, there are 3 kinds of falsehoods. There are lies, there are damned lies, and then there are statistics. Danny O'Connell, we both agree, was an average player that most people nowadays have never heard of. He was born in 1929, and he was one of about 1.1 million male Americans born that year. Of that number, 93, which if you're keeping score at home, that's 0.000834%, made it to the major leagues for even one day. Only 27 of that 93 played for all or part of 10 seasons. Danny O'Connell played for 12. Of the 20,000 plus major leaguers since 1876, fewer than 10% have had, fewer than 7% have had 1,000 hits in their career. Danny O'Connell had over 1,000 hits. So even though he's classified as a common player, he certainly didn't have an average career. But at the same time, and somewhat contradictorily, his career mirrored the career of most Major League Baseball players during his era, and even continuing into the modern era.
Yeah, and the era we're talking about is largely the 1950s and early 1960s. That was essentially, well, actually even a little earlier than that. His major league debut was 1950, right? But there was clearly a whole bunch of minor league development even prior to that, right? So let's say late 40s, right, through early 60s, right? So arguably maybe sort of a I don't know if it was a golden era, so to speak. I'm sure that I could fight lots of different people as to what golden eras they were, that they would sort of argue about. But in terms of, but I guess the question is, of that era, then there's probably a litany of players that you could have used as your measuring stick, if you will, or your vanguard, if you will, for, or your, the metaphor, if you will, for this story.
Right.
Why in particular him? Was it because of your own collection issue, or was there something else that kind of stuck out to you or was presented to you about him in particular?
Well, I think the impetus was just the coincidence that I remembered him vividly because I seemed to get so many of him in the first year that I really was serious about collecting baseball cards. But you're right. I could have picked any one of scores or even hundreds of players from his era. But his story was so compelling once I got into it. He's born in 1929, as I said.
In beautiful Paterson, New Jersey.
In Paterson, New Jersey.
I'm originally from the northern New Jersey area, so I can
okay. Well,
say that somewhat tongue in cheek.
Yes, I understand. But so his dad was a high school janitor. He was born 10 months before the Depression started. And even at an early age, all he ever wanted to do was play baseball. He was 5'2" and weighed 125 pounds when he got into high school. And yet he was the star athlete of his high school. He climbed the ladder that was absolutely almost a stereotype of baseball players in those days. He started in a D league where you drove your own car. You got $1.50 a day for meal money. The top salary was $75 a month. And then he went to B League and played in a team in Canada. Then he went to South Carolina and played in a team. Then he went to Minneapolis, St. Paul and played in a team. After 5 years in the minors, he made it to the major leagues in 1950. He had a great rookie season and was all primed to, have his career take off. And he was drafted. It was during the Korean War, and he spent the next 2 years playing baseball for the Army.
So sorry, he was with the Pirates at that time, correct?
He started with the Pirates, which was arguably one of the worst 10 teams in the history of baseball when he was there. There was a joke by Joe Garagiola, who was a catcher for the Pirates, that we finished 8th. We would have finished worse, but there were only 8 teams. So that was the kind of team he joined. But he immediately became the best player on the team. And he was there until 1953 season. And after that, he was sold to the Milwaukee Braves for an unheard of $250,000 and 6 players, which was the largest number of players traded for a single player ever. And
so he had some value, right? I mean, not standout per se, right? But certainly enough to be worthy of getting some good stuff in return.
Oh, he had huge at the time. He had huge potential value. The Braves in 1953 was their first season in Milwaukee. They had moved from Boston, where they drew less than 200,000 for the season. And in their first year in Milwaukee, they drew over 1 million fans. In fact, set a new major league attendance record. And they finished second place. They were poised, they thought, to get to the World Series. And he looked to be the missing link. He was the one guy they needed, was a good, steady second baseman. He had a decent year for the Braves his first year. He had a bad year the second year, had a decent year the third year. And then in 1957, about midway through the season, he was traded to the New York Giants. The Braves went on to win the World Series that year without him. But his consolation prize of playing for the Giants was they were in New York and he lived in New Jersey. He was just right across the bridge from the Polo Grounds, and he figured that would be an easy commute, only to find the Giants moved to San Francisco in 1958. And so he had the kind of career that you could qualify as almost. He almost was Rookie of the Year. He almost made a World Series team. He almost made an All-Star team. He had a lot of almosts in his career, but never quite got to that level where people would remember his name, I think. And that fascinated me too, because his athletic skills were good enough to get to the major leagues, but his baseball intelligence was good enough to keep him there. And the combination of just enough ability at a lot of things on the field and the ability to think a play ahead and do the little things that didn't show up in the statistics is what kept him in the big leagues, for more than a decade.
Well, already he's got some very extraordinary things about him and where he was already. I mean, maybe not him individually, but he's around some pretty interesting stories that are going on around there, right? So, for example, the Milwaukee Braves, right? That's, the Braves were quite a phenomenon in Milwaukee for a period of time.
That's right.
It was kind of really in the midst of all of that, and Milwaukee was really proving itself as worthy of being a major league city, right? We've talked about this theme over and over again about how certain cities were trying to become literally and figuratively major league, and the Braves were absolutely Milwaukee's assumed ticket to such.
Right.
But even for that, though, I mean, the fact that he took 2 years out to he wasn't his choice, right? Drafted to the Korean War. I mean, how common was that, or uncommon was that? I mean, it's certainly, if you will, an all-American, service-based kind of thing there, right? Not unlike World War II and the how many players went and not all of them came back, of course. How common was that, the Korean War service interrupting a fledgling baseball career?
It was quite common. It was more common for minor league players. Major league players weren't hit as hard for a lot of different reasons. But it wasn't as common as it was in World War II, because frankly, it was a much smaller war. But it was common, and the problem for baseball players is they have a very finite lifespan when it comes to their careers, and when you lose two full seasons out of your career, that's a telling blow. So he wasn't the only one to go to lose a couple of years, but it certainly was a impediment to his career.
Well, but again, it's in my mind, that's also an extraordinarily ordinary, right? In that he's able to go, to your point, 2 years out of the game, come back, play with the Pirates, and then get traded to the Braves at the major league level, right? It wasn't like he was immediately, brought back down for further seasoning and stuff. Obviously, that happened a little bit later in his career, but that itself is a pretty interesting story, right? More than just a story for your grandkids, right?
Right, and the fact of the matter is his career, and you were talking earlier about baseball and that period being so-called golden era. Baseball sort of mirrored what was going on in America during the post-war years. You think about this, in 1946, which was Danny O'Connell's first year in professional baseball, it was also Jackie Robinson's first year in what was called organized baseball, excluding the Negro Leagues. And when Danny O'Connell was playing in a Class D team in Binghamton, New Jersey, Jackie Robinson was debuting with the Montreal team, Montreal Royals, for the Dodger organization. So O'Connell started his professional career at the same time baseball was opening up to African Americans. And the struggles that baseball went through in adapting to that sort of mirrored what was going on with the civil rights movement in the 50s in America. And it's a brutal truth that while integration was absolutely necessary and absolutely a must for the good of the country and for the good of humanity, I guess you could say. As a professional baseball player, it certainly increased the competition for guys like Danny O'Connell. When he got to the major leagues in 1950, there were maybe a dozen African Americans playing. When he left, in his final season in 1962, over a quarter of the players in the major leagues were African American, and probably another 15% were from Latin America. So that's one example of how baseball mirrored what was going on in America, and how Danny O'Connell's career mirrored what was going on in baseball.
There's another thread that I sort of see here. It's not in your impressive PR materials here for the book, but I'll throw it in there. Maybe it's another bullet point that you can revise with, for what it's worth.
Yeah,
it's interesting to see, at least at the MLB level, he is playing with teams that are either in their first year of existence or maybe second year of existence. So it's almost like he's almost in a, I wouldn't call it entrepreneurial, but sort of early stages franchise building kind of role, even though he might not know it or have signed up for it, right? Milwaukee Braves, right? He's there in the second year that they're there, or maybe the first year, I don't know, 54, 55-ish from Boston, right? So This is a team that's completely relocated and completely trying to endear itself to a brand new market. The New York to San Francisco thing, right? The first season he's playing in 57 is at the old Polo Grounds.
right.
Whether he knows or not that they're going to San Francisco the next year, and then they're playing in temporary digs in San Francisco the next 2 years, and San Francisco welcomed this team like they had just landed on the moon. And then even in coaching, right, when he went into like the Washington Senators, right, which was a hastily arranged new franchise to replace the old one that moved to Minnesota, and even the Mets in 64 when he had a cup of coffee there, they were new and fledgling as well, right? So I'm sure there's really not much more there than that sort of thought there, but there must have been some level of I don't know, youthful or exuberance or excitement about building something, because he was kind of there for a lot of building blocks for each of these teams.
Yeah, it's true, except that there are nuances among the last three of the four teams he was with. When he went to Milwaukee, they'd been there a year. They had a hugely successful year at the box office, had all kinds of money. But they were already a solid team, at least at their core, when they came from Boston to Milwaukee. They built on it. They had some rookies and some young players, but they had players who had played in the major leagues and were good enough to play at that level. When he went to New York for the Giants, and then they moved to San Francisco, they were the toast of the town, but San Francisco had a very successful minor league team. But for O'Connell, it was like getting a new lease on life, because any of the baggage that he had built up in Milwaukee for not living up to what everybody thought was his potential, and then only having half a season in New York, it was like a brand new lease on life for him for the first year. The bloom wore off fairly quickly for him, and for the Giants a little bit later. And from a personal standpoint, and this is something I think people forget, his wife was a New Jersey girl. She'd never been outside of New Jersey. She had dutifully married and moved to Milwaukee and lived in different apartments during spring training and in Milwaukee, come back to New Jersey for a little while, gone to spring training again. And now suddenly she was being uprooted with their two baby girls, and to live 3,000 miles away on the West Coast. So that was a strain. When in his career, after the 1959 season, he was cut and was sent to took a job in the minor leagues. And in 1961, when, as you mentioned, the American League expanded with a new franchise in Washington and one in Los Angeles, the way it was set up was teams could protect X number of players on their roster, and then the new expansion teams could pick a player for $75,000, which they paid to the team that owned the guy's rights. O'Connell was a free agent, so he went to the meetings that they were having for the minor leagues in Tennessee and sold himself, basically. He said, look, give me $5,000 and I'm a proven major league player, and I'll save you $70,000 and you won't even pay me anything near that in a salary. So he sold himself to become, as you said, part of a new product in Washington, D.C. And it worked. He played there for 2 years. He was the best player on the team his first year there. And so, again, as I said before, he mirrored baseball because baseball expanded for the first time and he took advantage of it. Those two teams don't show up. He's not in the major leagues anymore.
Very interesting. But also he's mirroring what I'm guessing at the time was a fairly common existence among, again, sort of the average baseball player set, which is, and it's probably harder to believe today by comparison, but probably a more common and liberal use of going up and down from the majors to the minors as needed, and as or tell me, was he more traveled than average up and down?
No, he was probably average in terms of the teams that he played for in the big leagues. There were players that were yo-yoed up and down between the minor leagues and the majors. But remember, in the so-called golden age of baseball, players were basically indentured servants. They could not play out a contract and sign with another team.
Right.
They could be given 30 days pay and a one-way ticket home and cut if they didn't make the grade. They could be traded without their consent anywhere the owner of the team decided to send them. They could be sent down and sent up again. O'Connell's value was so much beyond his statistics or his on-field play, because A, he could play a lot of positions, which was relatively rare in those days, and B, he was almost like an extra coach. He was Leo DeRocher, the famous or infamous longtime major league manager, who was not known for giving out compliments to opposing players, said that Danny O'Connell will win more games with his brains than with his bat. And what he was talking about was O'Connell's ability to hit behind the runner, to do a lot of things that are sort of arcane to non-baseball fans, but to sacrifice, to go from first to third on a ground ball to the outfield. And those things made him valuable. And plus he was very well liked. He was a very funny guy. He had a great native wit. He was in demand as an after dinner speaker in the off season. And so he was just a good guy to be in the clubhouse with and a good teammate. And that counted for something when you're playing an 8-month season with 25 other personalities.
All right, what's this? Royal Retros. All right, longtime fans of this show may remember a little site that we used to promote the heck out of called 503 Sports. Well, not only are they still around, they are now known as Royal Retros. RoyalRetros.com, the king of throwbacks. And like the name implies, the highest quality jerseys and hats and apparel and all kinds of stuff related to various teams and leagues and situations that we love to obsess about here on this show. And I'm talking about getting jerseys with your name and number on the back of them, customized to your liking for the WHA or old NHL hockey teams that may not exist anymore. Perhaps it's a Federal League team from way back or a Negro League team. Maybe you're just enamored with the various football leagues of the past, like the Arena League or the All-American Football Conference or the original UFL, United Football League. Yes, you can get all of those teams in all kinds of colors, away jerseys, home jerseys. You want to put your name on them. You want to make sure you got the official patch on the side. All of those things and more at RoyalRetros.com. And I'm not kidding, friends. You go there, you want to find that Cleveland Barons jersey to wear and show. Hey, you're maybe a Colorado Avalanche fan and you want to represent the Quebec Nordiques from where they came in the arena to show your heritage and your love and knowledge of the history of that franchise. You can do that and more. And I'm talking across football and basketball and baseball and hockey and you name it. All kinds of great stuff for you to find and buy and purchase and wear proudly from Royal Retros. That's RoyalRetros.com. And of course, we have a promo code for you. We want to save you money from all these great things And here's that code. It's SEATS, SEATS, promo code SEATS for all of your purchases at royalretros.com. Check them out. You'll be glad you did. We love them. And our friend Destin Alameda there out in Portland, Oregon, we appreciate his and their sponsorship of this show. And now, back to our conversation. Give us a sense of what kind of a player he was in terms of his on-field performance. He had a couple of nibbles of some awards here and there, and some records either in season and for various teams and that kind of stuff. So this is a guy who I would argue is probably more above average, if you will, because he was very competitive in a lot of stats and stuff over the course of the career.
Yeah, I think his versatility made him. You can make the argument he was above average. I'll give you an example. In one season or another during his career, he finished in his league's top 10 in singles, doubles, triples, walks, stolen bases, sacrifices, fielding percentage, fielding range factor, and being hit by pitches. He held the consecutive games hitting streak for the Pittsburgh Pirates for more than 50 years. He held the most doubles in a season record for an expansion player for 35 years. He's still tied for the major league record for the most triples in one game. And he was the most valuable player on his first team, the Pittsburgh Pirates, and he was the most valuable player on his last team, the Washington Senators. But getting to that point more than the statistics, I'll give you an example of what kind of player he was. His very last play that he was involved in while wearing a major league uniform was in an old timers game between the Giants and the Dodgers in 1968. And he pulled the hidden ball trick on a Dodger player to end this little exhibition game they had. So that was the kind of player he routinely would pull the hidden ball trick or drop a fly in the infield and get a double play or do something like that almost every year. So that's the kind of, he not only had some statistical bursts of greatness, or at least goodness, but he also would win games by being a heady player.
And I suspect also a collegial presence in the clubhouse, fairly well liked and respected, and if not standout, that kind of thing.
Very, very well liked. He was a comedian, for one thing. He was a very funny guy, kept people loose in the clubhouse. He had an excellent singing voice, and he actually would entertain all the teams he played for with his singing voice. In fact, when he was playing in the minor leagues in Tacoma, there was a rain delay, and there were 3,000 or 4,000 disgruntled fans. And O'Connell got up on top of the dugout and led them in a sing-along until the rain stopped. So that's the kind of guy he was. Another anecdote was he was playing first base one day, and the umpires all got together and were huddling over some call they were making. And O'Connell wandered over and kind of stood there looking over their shoulder. And one of the umpires said, "What the hell are you doing here, O'Connell?" And O'Connell said, "Well, I might want to be an umpire after I retire, and just want to see what you guys talk about." And the umpires all cracked up and sent him away, but they all laughed at it. So that's the kind of thing he would do, and it was much appreciated by the players in a pennant race.
It's interesting too. Some of the teams here. So this is the first appearance of the York White Roses.
Right.
That's hit our radar. That was sort of near sort of the end of his career. But who knew that York, Pennsylvania had a team pretty much from 1884 all the way through 1969.
Right.
And he had that on there. Did he, from what you could tell, and so then I want to get into kind of your reference material. From what you could tell, did he, how much, I guess, would he say that he was enjoying his baseball career? I mean, he'd obviously made it to the majors, had stuck for quite some time. He had left and come back after war. Perhaps didn't last as long, perhaps near the end of his career as he might have wanted to at the top tier and stuff. He died when he was 40, right? So I'm wondering, how perhaps, and maybe it's impossible to tell, how satisfied he was with his baseball career, and what I'm assuming at the time was maybe perhaps a managerial career that was maybe still ahead of him.
He loved the game. He had retired as a player because he just, frankly, just his back and his legs were killing him his last year. And he retired in 1962 as his last season. The Washington team hired him as a player manager for the York team that you mentioned in the minor leagues. And he managed there for about a month and a half. And the Senators fired their big league manager and hired Gil Hodges, a Hall of Fame player, and made him their manager. And he made Danny O'Connell his coach, or his head coach. And O'Connell coached for 2 years. But the problem for him was he had 4 young kids. He was in his mid-30s. You made next to no money as a Major League Baseball coach. And he had a family to feed. And he reluctantly quit coaching to take a job basically as a handshaker and an after-dinner speaker for a plumbing company in New Jersey. And he liked it okay, but his family told me that he always had this yin that someday somebody would knock on the door. And he did have a few feelers to get back into baseball as a coach or a manager. Unfortunately, tragically for him, he was coming home from an after-dinner speech in New Jersey, just a few miles from his home. And he had a massive heart attack, ran into a utility pole and died at the age of 40. He left behind 4 small kids and a wife that had never worked. And they survived. And I want to get in a little bit, I don't want to get too far afield, but I'd like to mention the heroism of this guy in terms of everyday average, quiet, working man heroism. In those days, you needed 10 years in the big leagues to qualify for a full pension. When he was cut by the Giants, he was lacking about, I want to say 4 months or 5 months of his 10 years. He went to Tacoma voluntarily as a minor league player, had a great year, made the all-star team in that league, sold himself to the Washington Senators, got in 2 more years, so he was fully vested in the pension program, and invested pretty wisely, even as he was working for this plumbing supply company. And as a result, when he died, his pension went to his widow. She never had to go to work. She raised the 4 kids. They all went to pretty prestigious colleges. They all had successful careers and are all living happy, prosperous lives. And that in large part has to do with the fact that their old man gutted it out, swallowed his pride, went and played in Tacoma, Washington for a year, and got back to the big league so he could qualify for that pension. Nowadays, when the minimum salary is $500,000 plus for an untested rookie, that's not so much of an issue. But in those days, it was a big deal. And I think it speaks to the kind of quiet hero maybe that exists among average players and average people for that matter. So that was another thing that made his story very compelling to me.
Well, that also sounds, again, based on a look back, say, to various accounts of the 1950s, shall we say, almost sort of like the working class sort of image, right? Get that house in the suburbs and work for the man, so to speak, and do the right things and prosper as the country, gets back on its feet and helps lead the world back out of World War and all that kind of stuff, right? So it almost feels to me like that that sort of northern New Jersey lunch pail middle class kind of work ethic, right, is another sort of emblematic, scenario here where he's almost a tremendous example of that in general, not just baseball players, but just in general about family first and figuring out how to make the ends meet, right? Because that says a lot, right? That sort of quiet hero dynamic. I'm not sure that every American male was as noble as he was in that pursuit, but it does speak to, I think, I call it the greatest generation. I don't know, maybe I'm bastardizing Tom Brokaw's thing, but to me, that doesn't sound too dissimilar from the sort of ideal, male, silhouette for that era.
Absolutely. And that, I think you're absolutely hitting it on the head. And There is a variation to that theme, which was the Major League Baseball player in the 1950s. They made salaries. His average salary probably in the middle of his career was in the $14,000 range, which was probably about 3 times what the average American family was bringing in. That sounds great. It sounds like he was living the life of Riley. But the fact of the matter is, the average baseball career at the major league level lasted less than 5 years. So they had to make it while they could. And they also had to plan what they were going to do at the age of 34, 35 when their career was gone. And most of these guys didn't have much education. They'd been playing baseball since they were kids, including Danny O'Connell. And so he was a lunch pail American, making a lot more than the average lunch pail American during his career, but then he had to go get a job after his career. And in fact, most Major League Baseball players, unless they were superstars, had off-season jobs to supplement their incomes from playing. Now, so you've got that sort of variation on the theme. But the other thing is, too, a lot of guys in the 1950s, they came home from the war, they got jobs, they worked their 35 years, they got pension and Social Security, and they retired. They didn't all get to do what they wanted to do. And Danny O'Connell, and I would say most Major League players in this era, loved baseball. They were willing to move, 24 times in their career and uproot their families or be away from their families for a long time to play a kid's game and get paid for it. It was, for him, life couldn't have been better than that. So I think even though his life was cut short and he was never a big star, he truly would never have changed a thing about his career.
You mentioned at the beginning, his card, when you were looking at it and its value and stuff, was in the couple of $1,000 range, right?
Well, that was for a mint card, and that's what they were asking. I don't know that they were getting that.
Well, but still, for a name that's not sort of very well recognized by the cognoscenti in baseball, right?
Yeah.
What do you attribute that value? Maybe even prior to this book, right? Arguably, it can be more valuable. But that sounds a little, even maybe the lesser sort of quality, right? Not the non-mint one, right? It sounds to me like that's still going to translate into something that's still a little bit more valuable than even the more average baseball player card from that era.
No, I'm afraid it doesn't. It really comes down baseball cards nowadays. Now, if you were talking about 30 years ago, that you'd be absolutely right. Nowadays, it doesn't matter who's on the card. It matters what condition it's in, what some company has graded it at, and it matters what the speculative value of the card is. So an average Danny O'Connell card in average condition, you can pick up for $10 on a lot of websites, and maybe less than that at a baseball card show. On the other hand, there are cards of players that have never done anything in the major leagues or have potential but have yet to prove it, that sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars because somebody's willing to bet that someday it's going to be, a really a Mickey Mantle or a Babe Ruth or somebody like that. And that's sort of what baseball card collecting has evolved into. It no longer matters so much as to who the player is, but what condition the card is in and what's it likely to be worth next week.
Interesting. Well, it does speak though to just this it does go in cycles, right? But the
Yes.
baseball card dynamic, right, especially now, seems to be on another boomlet, right? In terms of value and I perhaps maybe if there's also scarcity at this point, right, for players of his era.
Scarcity does come into it, and because of the scarcity of cards from, say, the 1950s, the graders of baseball cards may be a little more forgiving for, say, a 1955 card as opposed to a 2012 card. But it really gets to the heart of whether you collect any sports memorabilia of any sport for the nostalgia value because it means something to you. Because you follow the player or team as a kid, or you just like the player nowadays, or you're collecting because you're going to put your kid through college with your collection in 10 years. And a lot of those guys that collect that, and I'm not denigrating that by any means, because it's as good an investment value vehicle as anything else. They're not even baseball fans. I've run into people at national card shows who mispronounce the name of the player they're buying and have no clue who he is or was, simply because they know it's going to go up in value or they're getting a good deal.
Give me a sense of your approach to writing this story, the research, and how you sort of dug into his story. Like, how much of it was sort of, traditional research resources and that kind of stuff. How much was people who knew of him or were part of his family and that kind of stuff, first person accounts?
Probably, I hate to put a percentage on it, but maybe a third of it came from interviews with particularly with his younger sister and younger brother are still alive. And I talked to them. I talked to a couple of players that had played with him and had some anecdotes. Most of it, though, was from digging. One of the problems with doing a biography of a player who nobody's ever done a biography of before is there's no secondary source material to go to. And there are 25 books written on Willie Mays, so you start there. But there are no books written on Danny O'Connell or a lot of common players. So you start through newspaper morgues. I spent the better part of 2 weeks at the Milwaukee Public Library going day by day through the sports sections of the Milwaukee Journal and the Milwaukee Gazette, looking for things about Danny O'Connell.
And how much do you think you found in terms of comprehensiveness? What do you think you might have missed? Or were there things in his story that you found perhaps as you were doing this research and putting your narrative together that you didn't know the answer to, or maybe if he had been alive, you would have liked to have asked him about? Because you put this this sort of story of his life, into written form. I'm sure there's some. It would be very interesting to know some of the things that were going through his mind, let's say, when taking a job to fill out that last 2 years of a pension plan, that kind of stuff, right? I mean, you wonder what his thoughts were going to Korea. Did you ever think he was going to be coming back? Did you ever think he'd pick up his career when he came back? All that kind of stuff, right? Had to be a lot of fear and worry.
Absolutely. One thing that was particularly frustrating was every once in a while you'd come across a quote from him complaining about maybe the way he was treated by the press from a team, in particular in Milwaukee, where he said he was glad, he liked his time in Milwaukee, he loved the fans, he loved the team, but he thought the press blamed him too much for when the team didn't win. And yet I went through, as I said, pretty exhaustive search of the Milwaukee papers at the time, and I didn't find a whole lot of criticism about him. I found some, but I certainly didn't find anything that he would take a lot of offense to. So if I had a chance, one of the questions I'd ask him was, what in particular did they say about you that either wasn't fair or you really bothered you? And then the other question that I'd like to know is, when he left baseball for a better paying job, how close did he come to going back? Because when I talked to his family, they recalled ex-teammates would come and take him out to dinner. And some of those teammates were coaches or managers or worked for different teams. And they always wondered if the purpose of the dinners was to offer him a job that he turned down. And so I'd like to know, that's another thing I'd like to know about, what went through his head in terms of staying away from baseball.
And I'm assuming his kids, right, were relatively young, and sort of didn't have a whole lot of time and or memories, or maybe they had some. But how would you characterize the family members that you talked with in terms of their reverence towards or feelings about his career, his pursuit of that career, what he was able to do, what he wasn't able to do, pride, not much special, anything that sort of, I'm sure there's some level of immense pride, right? But I'm curious if you got any vibes as to sort of how the family sort of has looked upon his past, even though they may not have been part of it for too very long.
Well, it's kind of funny because when I originally decided to look into doing the book, I had a friend of mine who was a former police sergeant in San Diego and is now a private investigator find them for me, and it took him all of about 10 minutes to find all four of his kids. And when I contacted them initially, I could sense that they were a little suspicious. Why does somebody want to do a book about our dad, who was not a big star? And eventually, when they saw I was serious and not trying to run a scam or ask them to fund the book or anything, they became wildly enthusiastic because they all had great memories of their dad, particularly through their mom. His oldest daughter was 13 when he died. His youngest son was only 2. And one of the more poignant things I came across was his youngest son asked me when I was doing the research if I ever came across an audio of his dad's voice, he'd like to hear it because he didn't remember his dad's voice. And unfortunately, I never did find anything, any radio or other evidence of Danny O'Connell talking, but they were immensely proud of their dad, and not only for him being a big league baseball player, but for the kind of guy he was. He was a fun guy around the house. They all had great anecdotes about him taking them places, and one daughter in particular remembered going to fairs and carnivals, and if they had any of those booths where you threw a baseball or a softball at the milk bottles and knocked them down, they always came home with big giant stuffed animals because Danny knocked them all down. And so they were tremendously proud of what their dad put through. But it's sort of one of the reasons they were is something you touched on earlier, which was the ethos of this guy in going to work, providing for his family, being a loving father, and leaving his widow in good enough financial shape that she could be a good mother. And so they were proud of him for being a baseball player, but they were just as proud of him for being the kind of guy he apparently was.
Yeah, it's pretty neat, and it does seem to kind of just it's fairly it's fairly easy to kind of just juxtapose kind of what was going on in America, in New Jersey, in baseball, right? All these different places,
Right.
on the lines of his career. I mean, I wouldn't call him a Zelig character, but he's there in a lot of these different stories, and an interesting relief as background or as foreground for a humanizing sort of part of that story. So it's a very sort of brilliant conceit, and it's a very interesting a thread of story. And it's also interesting too that he round tripped from the beginnings in New Jersey to the end in New Jersey. So I don't know, maybe it's a good thing or not.
Yeah, he was a Jersey kid. He never strayed far. Home was always New Jersey, even when he was playing for the San Francisco Giants. They came home in the offseason in New Jersey. His family, first they traveled with when his 2 daughters were very young. His wife would travel with him. But once they got a little older and in school, they stayed home, and he did his thing on the baseball field. But he was a Jersey kid, and he never took that out of him.
All right, one last question, and I'll let you promote. Give me so we obsess on this show about sort of legacies and where people or teams should be, I guess, historically and rightly remembered, right? Where is the plaque? Where is the pennant? Where should be those memories and that history live? Even though some people don't think it might matter,
Right.
I kind of think it does, because things happen, people did things, teams existed, and it's, in my mind, it's kind of nice to know that there is a a through line to where that began and arguably, should reside. Now, this is a guy who played on multiple teams, right? Both on the majors and the minors.
Uh,
Put you on the spot. Where do you think? And I see his picture on Wikipedia, right? Is in Milwaukee Braves
right.
uniform. Where would you put him? If there's a Hall of Fame or a circle of remembrance, or if he were ever to have been associated probably most with a particular franchise, or is that sort of a ridiculous question because he wasn't really with a team for all that great a period of time?
Yeah, it's not a ridiculous question. It's a tough one to answer though, because on the one hand,
Or maybe him, like if based on what you know of him. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but do
I
you
think
think he would want to be like
I
sort of?
think he'd want to be in New York for his very half season with the New York Giants before they moved, because as I said, he was a Jersey kid. He is in the Irish American Sports Hall of Fame, which up until COVID was in a sports bar in New York City in Manhattan, and I'm not sure where it is now, if it even exists anymore.
As somebody who is of Irish descent, I need to find that place. But okay, I digress.
And there was a little league field in Paterson that was named after him, and it's still there. But to show you, getting to your point about how times change, I went to his boyhood home in Paterson, and which is still standing, and knocked on a few doors and talked to some neighbors. None of them had ever heard of Danny O'Connell. None of them were baseball fans. Some of them were fanatic soccer fans, or as they said, football fans. Where his little league field is in the park near his house when he was a kid, there are two big, very well appointed soccer fields, and the little league field is pretty sad. So that just shows you how times have changed, even for him and his homeland. But I think probably he might pick the Polo Grounds. He went there as a kid, and his dad would take him to games for the Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Giants. And that was home. And he was disappointed when they moved to San Francisco, but he took it in stride because it was his job. He might pick Pittsburgh because that was where his greatest success was. And he was very well liked in Pittsburgh by the fans. He was treated very well.
All right. And last question, also probably somewhat putting you on the spot. In terms of the actual baseball cards, right? I'm sure there are a number of cards with him in his major league ports of call. I wonder if there were any cards in that era in any of his minor league stops.
I'm sorry, there was one when he played for Indianapolis. They put out a cracker company in Chicago, put out a card set of the team, and that was his very first baseball card.
So of those, that's interesting. Okay, so of that one minor league and the rest all major league cards, do you have any sense of which one is probably most valuable in this? And because I also asked this question, maybe semi-selfishly for you, because I'm sure his profile is going to be a little bit higher now that this book comes out.
It could be. Probably the most valuable overall would have been in the 1953 top set, because it's mainly because it's the most collectible set of all the sets he was in. Generally speaking, most players, it's their rookie card, which was a 1950 Bowman card, which is about the size of a large postage stamp and not very attractive. So in terms of monetary value, I think probably the 53 Topps card. He would probably prefer some very obscure cards that were put out in Milwaukee in 1955 and 56 by a cookie company there. And they're very handsome looking cards, and he looks great on them. He's in action throwing the ball to first base. And I suspect he'd pick one of those.
Yeah, and it's also interesting too. You said it earlier too. You juxtapose, his career, his solid, let's say, career, against the economics of today, right? You wonder what kind of salary and what kind of future he would have gotten these days, right? And I think it's probably another part of your story here, right? Is this was a different era of player, different economics for sure.
Right.
You wonder. I can't imagine his progeny doesn't wonder what would life be like had he had been, a player at this day and age, and perhaps some of the generational wealth, arguably, if smart, could have been could have been made and saved and passed along in this era.
Yeah, that never came up with any of the kids. The one sort of wishful thinking came up was he had been a trusted coach for Gil Hodges when Gil Hodges was the manager of the Washington Senators. Danny O'Connell resigned, and a couple of years, or actually a year later, Gil Hodges moved on to the New York Mets to become the manager, and the Mets then went on to win the World Series. And so the family's what if was what if Dad had stayed with Hodges, gone on to New York, and he would have finally gotten his World Series ring when the Mets won the 1969 World Series. And that was the year Danny died. In fact, he died a couple of days before the World Series started, and Hodges went out of his way to pay tribute to him.
That's a beautiful testimony, and maybe a nice closing of circle in that regard, right? Especially given his New Jersey and New York roots,
right,
and all of that. This has been a very eye-opening conversation and book and story, and I wish you the best with it, because I do think it does speak more. It is at once a biography of a major league player of a certain era that was not necessarily extraordinary, but extraordinary in his own way, and largely through what he represented amongst other players of the era. And a lot of great themes in here. And I think it's a wonderful take on how to do it. Not unlike, and maybe this is maybe where your publisher is hoping for that book last year. I forget his name, who did that book on the, I guess he opened a pack of cards or something, and then he literally went out to find what these guys had become from that over time.
Oh, right. Yeah. He took a single pack of cards and then went to see.
But it became a phenomenon as a book, right? So I think that this is a great hook, and I think it's a testament to you, to just the sheer blurbs that you got in the book, Bob Costas on down.
Yeah,
I think it was fantastic.
It was a labor of love. It was a sometimes infuriating labor of love, but
why? Because you couldn't find, because you couldn't access stats, or
the grind. Okay. I'm old enough to remember when newspapers A, existed, and B, published the box scores. And as a kid, I loved going through the box scores of baseball games. As a septuagenarian, sitting in the library, cold, drafty library, with going through microfilm day after day after day, looking at blurry box scores, I was really wishing he'd only played 3 years instead of 10 years, because I had to go through a whole lot of box scores.
Well, I guess there's a positive to that, in that at least this was not a player who has his every waking moment videoed and put on YouTube and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah.
I mean, the rabbit holes you could go down just by the sheer proliferation of information and data today.
Right.
That's got to be maddening.
Yeah, and it's an embarrassment of riches sometimes too. But in other books that I've done, I've gone through microfilm newspapers and been distracted by the sports sections. And in this book, I went through the sports sections and I was just distracted by what was going on page one. So you can never be satisfied when you're doing this kind of work.
All right. Many thanks to Steve Wiegand for that very interesting story. The book, really interesting as well. Beyond just the conversation, you should get the book. It does so much more than we were able to get to. Really well written, greatly researched, and frankly, such a metaphor for life back in the day, and baseball and sports memorabilia and all that kind of stuff. Really, really interesting story. Again, it is called The Uncommon Life of Danny O'Connell, a tale of baseball cards, quote, average players, and the true value of America's game. It is published by Bancroft Press, and it is available, as they say, wherever fine books are found. If you'd like to go down the street to your local independent bookseller and have them order you a copy, by all means, support them and do so. If you'd like to go directly to Amazon or BarnesandNoble.com or any of those places and buy the book that way, go for it. If you'd like to give us a few shekels of referral love and get shipped to you via Amazon, we'd appreciate that for sure. Just go to our website, goodseatsstillavailable.com. Search up this episode with Steve Wiegand, numbered 355, and you'll find a convenient couple of links to the book, courtesy of Amazon, in both hardcover and Kindle versions. And we, of course, would tip our baseball cap in your general direction in thanks for doing so that way. While you're online or on the website, you can tool around and see all of our all the episodes we've ever done. We post them all in there. You can also go to our merch section if you'd like and find, as suggested, merch. You can find convenient links to our pals at oldschoolshirts.com and royalretros.com and a whole host of garb, including logo wear featuring our logo for our little show at TeePublic. All of those links there are the merch page on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. You want to send us some email, please, by all means, do so. We're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. You can follow us on social media. On Twitter X, we are at goodseatsstill. And just about everywhere else, we are at Good Seats Still Available. That includes the Instagram and the Threads and the YouTube and the Facebook. And there you go. And, of course, our thanks, as always, to Jerry Payne. Jerry Payne Audio Excellence. You can't beat it. He's been with us for 7+ years and hasn't complained yet, although we're looking for ways to get him to do so. No, hopefully not. We could not do this show without his editorial guidance and his wizardry with the push buttons. So we appreciate his help, as always, this week. And, of course, we cannot be more appreciative of your listenership and your comments and suggestions and just touching bases and, retweets and all that kind of stuff. We appreciate that to no end. And we hope we can continue to serve you with honor and vigor in the weeks and months to come. Lots of great stories and conversations coming your way. Thank you for listening this week. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.